December wind cuts through Millfield's main street like a rusty blade. Ice crystals hang from storefront eaves and the metallic taste of snow fills the air. Boot heels echo on frozen boardwalks. Sheriff Wade Garrett watches from his office window as banker Silas Whitmore nails foreclosure papers to Martha Crenshaw's front door. The widow stands in her nightgown, clutching a shawl, while neighbors peer from behind curtains. Whitmore's voice carries across the frozen street. Christmas Eve deadline. Property reverts to First National Bank per mortgage default. Martha's knees buckle. Her children peer through frost-covered windows, their breath fogging the glass. Wade's badge catches morning light as his hand moves to his gun belt, then stops. The foreclosure notice flutters like a white surrender flag against Martha's weathered door. Righteous fury wars with legal helplessness in Wade's chest. Wade steps toward the door, then hears paper rustling behind him. A second foreclosure notice lies on his desk, bearing his own address. Wade's coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but the metallic taste in his mouth wasn't from the bitter brew. He spread Martha Crenshaw's mortgage papers across his desk, the parchment crackling like autumn leaves. Outside, the wind howled through the gaps in his office walls, carrying the scent of wood smoke and impending snow. The numbers didn't make sense. Martha's original loan showed 6% interest. The first payment receipt showed 8. The latest demand letter claimed 12. Charlie, Wade called to Martha's 16-year-old son, who sat hunched by the pot-bellied Storetzel. When did your ma first sign these papers? Charlie looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from more than just the cold. Right after Pa died. Spring of '71. Mr. Whitmore said it was temporary, just to keep the farm running. Wade's finger traced the dates. April 1871, but the signature line showed March 1870, a full year before Martha's husband died. The ink on that date looked fresher than the rest, bleeding slightly into the fiber. The boy's boots scuffed against the wooden floor as he shifted closer. Sheriff Garrett, Ma ain't eaten proper in 3 days. She's giving all the food to me and Sissy. Your ma's a strong woman, Charlie. We'll figure this out. But Wade's certainty felt as thin as the ice forming on his window. He folded the papers and tucked them into his coat pocket. The metallic taste grew stronger, like sucking on a copper penny during a lightning storm. Come on, son. Let's pay Dutch McKenna a visit. The blacksmith's forge glowed like a red eye in the gathering dusk. Dutch McKenna stood with his back to them, hammer ringing against hot iron in a steady rhythm that echoed off the workshop walls. Steam rose from a quenching bucket, carrying the sharp smell of heated metal and coal smoke. Dutch! Wade's voice cut through the hammering. The rhythm stopped. Dutch set down his hammer but didn't turn around. His shoulders, once broad as a barn door, seemed diminished somehow. The limp in his left leg had gotten worse over the years, more pronounced in the cold. Wade, Dutch's voice carried no warmth. Heard about Martha's troubles. Figured you might take a look at her papers. You always had a good eye for detail. Had. Dutch finally turned, his weathered face shadowed in the forge light. These days I stick to horseshoes and plowshares. Less complicated. Charlie stepped forward, his young voice breaking slightly. Please, Mr. McKenna, Ma says you and the sheriff go way back. From the war. Something flickered across Dutch's face. Pain, maybe, or old anger. He wiped his hands on his leather apron, the motion deliberate and slow. Some things from the war are best left buried, boy. Wade felt the gulf between them like a physical thing, cold and wide as a winter river. They'd served together in the 5th Texas Infantry, survived Shiloh and Antietam. Dutch had been the one to pull Wade from the mud at Fredericksburg when Confederate grape shot tore through their lines. Martha's got 3 days, Dutch. Christmas Eve deadline. And what's that to me? Dutch's voice had grown harder, like the iron cooling on his anvil. Wade pulled out the mortgage papers, but Dutch held up his hand. Don't want to see them. Got my own troubles to worry about. The forge fire popped and hissed, sending sparks dancing across the dirt floor. Wade caught the scent of something else in the smoke. Fear, sharp and acrid. What kind of troubles? Dutch limped back to his anvil, picked up a half-finished horseshoe with his tongs, the kind that reminds a man to mind his own business. Since when do you back down from a fight? Since I learned the difference between fighting and dying. Dutch thrust the iron back into the coals, the flames leaping higher. You should learn it too before it's too late. Charlie tugged at Wade's sleeve. Sheriff? What's he mean? But Dutch had already turned away, his hammer resuming its steady beat against the iron. Each strike seemed to drive a wedge deeper between them, echoing off the walls like the sound of doors slamming shut. Wade guided Charlie toward the door, the cold air hitting them like a slap after the forge's heat. Behind them, Dutch's voice rose over the hammering, just loud enough to carry. "Some debts can't be paid with friendship, Wade. You'd do well to remember that." The words followed them into the night, carried on wind that tasted of snow and secrets. Wade pulled his coat tighter, but the chill had already settled deep in his bones. Charlie looked up at him, confusion and fear warring in his young face. "What did he mean about debts, Sheriff?" Wade didn't answer. He was thinking about the metallic taste that wouldn't leave his mouth, about the way Dutch's hand had trembled when he refused to look at the papers, about friendships that could die as quickly as hopes in a harsh winter. Something was coming, something worse than foreclosure papers and hungry children. The taste of copper pennies grew stronger on his tongue. The town hall reeked of unwashed wool and nervous sweat. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across the worried faces of Millfield's citizens, packed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches that creaked with every anxious shift. The December wind rattled the windows like skeletal fingers, and Wade could taste the metallic fear hanging thick in the air. Banker Silas Whitmore stood at the front of the room, his black suit immaculate despite the weather, gold watch chain glinting in the lamplight. He'd arranged his documents on the makeshift podium with theatrical precision, each paper perfectly aligned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore's voice carried easily over the murmuring crowd, "I've called this emergency session to address the unfortunate rumors circulating about the bank's foreclosure activities." Wade leaned against the back wall, his badge heavy on his chest. He'd counted 17 families in the crowd facing similar mortgage troubles, 17 families who looked to him for protection he couldn't provide. "These foreclosures," Whitmore continued, "are conducted in strict accordance with territorial law, every document properly filed, every deadline clearly stated." He lifted a thick leather portfolio. "I have here certified copies of all mortgage agreements, witnessed and notarized." Old Henrik Jensen stood up, his weathered hands shaking. "My family's been farming that land for 20 years, Whitmore. Now you're saying I owe 3 times what I borrowed?" "Interest compounds, Mr. Jensen. Surely you understand basic mathematics." "Basic theft, more like," someone called from the crowd. Whitmore's smile never wavered, but Wade caught the flash of something cold in his eyes. "Sheriff Garrett, perhaps you'd like to address these misconceptions about lawful banking practices?" The crowd turned toward Wade, expectant faces in the lamplight. He pushed off from the wall, feeling every eye upon him. The floorboards groaned under his boots as he walked forward. "I've examined some of these documents," Wade said carefully. "There appear to be irregularities." "Irregularities?" Whitmore's eyebrows rose in practiced surprise. "Sheriff, I hope you're not suggesting that First National Bank would engage in fraudulent practices." "I'm saying the numbers don't add up." Whitmore opened his portfolio with a flourish. "Perhaps this will clarify matters." He produced a letter bearing the territorial seal, official correspondence from the Territorial Banking Commission, confirming all our procedures comply with federal guidelines. Wade's stomach dropped. The letter looked genuine, complete with official stamps and signatures. Whitmore passed it to Mayor Collins, who squinted at it in the lamplight before nodding gravely. "Seems to be in order, Sheriff," Collins said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, his confidence building, "I must question Sheriff Garrett's objectivity in this matter. After all, he faces his own mortgage difficulties with this very bank." The crowd's murmur rose to a buzz. Wade felt heat creeping up his neck, the metallic taste growing stronger. "That has nothing to do with, doesn't it?" Whitmore's voice cut sharp as winter wind. "A man facing foreclosure might be motivated to find fault where none exists." Mayor Collins cleared his throat. "Wade, is this true? About your mortgage?" The silence stretched like a taut rope. Wade could hear the oil lamps hissing, the wind pressing against the windows, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Yes," he said finally. "But that doesn't change what I've seen in these documents." "What you think you've seen," Whitmore corrected smoothly. "Desperation can cloud a man's judgment." The crowd began to shift, whispers spreading like wildfire. Wade watched 17 families' faith in him crumble, saw doubt creeping into their faces like frost on glass. Mayor Collins stood, his decision written in the slump of his shoulders. "I'm sorry, Wade. Given the circumstances, I think we have to accept Mr. Whitmore's documentation." The gavel's bang echoed like a gunshot, Martha Crenshaw's kitchen smelled of lye soap and desperation. She sat at her wooden table, hands wrapped around a cup of chicory coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Wade occupied the chair across from her, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "The council sided with Whitmore," he said, the words bitter as the dregs in Martha's cup. Martha nodded, unsurprised. "Figured they would. Man with money talks louder than a woman with empty pockets." Charlie sat by the window, whittling a piece of pine with angry, jerky movements. His sister Sarah, barely 8 years old, played with cornhusk dolls on the floor, oblivious to the adult conversation. "There's something else," Wade said. "About Dutch. About why he won't help." Martha looked up sharply. "What about Dutch?" Wade's throat felt tight. The words had been locked inside him for 3 years, festering like an infected wound. "Battle of Stone Ridge, October '63. We were retreating through the woods, Confederates coming up behind us fast." The whittling stopped. Charlie looked over, his young face serious. "Dutch got tangled in some wire," Wade continued. "I had to choose. Help him or secure the ammunition we were carrying. That ammunition could have saved dozens of lives." "So you helped Dutch," Martha said softly. "No." The word came out like a physical blow. "I secured the ammunition. Told myself it was the right choice. The greater good." Martha's hands tightened around her cup. "By the time I got back, Confederate grapeshot had torn up Dutch's leg pretty good. He never said anything about it. Never blamed me, but he's walked with that limp ever since." The only sound was the wind rattling the windows and Sarah's quiet humming as she played. Wade could smell the wood smoke from the fireplace, the faint scent of Martha's soap, the lingering aroma of the meager supper they'd shared. "Dutch never told you?" Martha asked finally. Wade shook his head. "He told me." Martha's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. 3 years ago, when he was drunk on Christmas Eve. Said he understood why you made that choice. Said he'd have done the same thing." Wade looked up sharply. But he also said it didn't matter. Understanding something and forgiving it are two different things. Martha met his eyes. "That's why he won't help, Wade. Not because he hates you, because every time he looks at you, he remembers that his friend chose duty over loyalty." The words hit Wade like a physical blow. Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow against the windows with a sound like scattered bones. Charlie's voice broke the silence, thick with confusion and hurt. "So nobody's going to help us?" "That's why he won't help." The county courthouse smelled of dust and old leather, with an underlying tang of ink and bureaucracy that reminded Wade of Army supply tents. Judge Harrison's clerk, a thin man named Pettigrew, moved between towering stacks of territorial records like a spider navigating its web. "Mortgage fraud cases," Wade said, following Pettigrew down a narrow aisle between filing cabinets. "Anything involving irregular interest rates or document alterations." Pettigrew's spectacles caught the lamplight as he pulled down a heavy ledger. "Not many folks challenge the banks, Sheriff. Takes considerable evidence to make such claims stick." The pages crackled as they turned, filled with spidery handwriting and official stamps. Wade could hear mice scratching in the walls, the distant sound of boots on the courthouse steps, the wheeze of the clerk's breathing in the dusty air. "Here," Pettigrew said, pointing to a case from 2 years prior. "Cattleman named Morrison challenged First National over similar irregularities. Interest rates that kept changing, dates that didn't align." Wade leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. "What happened?" "Case dismissed. Insufficient evidence." Pettigrew flipped the page. "Morrison lost his ranch anyway. Moved his family to California, last I heard." The metallic taste returned to Wade's mouth, but he pressed on. 3 more cases, all similar patterns, all dismissed for lack of evidence, all families forced from their land. "Wait." Pettigrew's finger stopped on an entry near the bottom of the page. "This is interesting. Territorial Statute 347B, ratified last spring. Any mortgage document bearing signatures dated before the actual loan agreement is considered prima facie evidence of fraud." Wade felt something stir in his chest. Hope, fragile as a winter bird. Prima facie. Legal presumption of fraud unless proven otherwise. Burden of proof shifts to the bank. Pettigrew cleaned his spectacles carefully. Of course, you'd need to prove the dates were altered after the fact. That's the tricky part. Outside, church bells chimed the hour, 3 o'clock. Wade gathered his notes, the papers rustling like dry leaves. The scent of old leather and forgotten promises clung to his coat as he headed for the door. "Sheriff," Pettigrew called after him. "Morrison tried to fight this alone. Didn't work out well for him." The courthouse steps were slick with ice, but Wade's stride had purpose now. One clause, one slim chance. If he could prove those dates had been changed. The taste of copper pennies was fading, replaced by something sharper, something that might have been hope. Dutch's forge glowed against the gathering dusk, sparks dancing like fireflies in the cold air. The familiar ring of hammer on iron echoed from the workshop, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. Wade approached slowly, Charlie trailing behind him with a bundle of Martha's documents clutched in his mittened hands. "Dutch," Wade called over the hammering. The rhythm stopped. Dutch straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the December cold. Steam rose from his leather apron, carrying the sharp scent of hot metal and coal smoke. "Thought I made myself clear, Wade. Just need 5 minutes. For Martha's sake, not mine." Dutch set down his hammer, the motion deliberate and tired. "Martha's troubles ain't my troubles." Charlie stepped forward, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. McKenna, please, just look at the papers. You don't have to help the sheriff. Help my ma." Something flickered across Dutch's weathered features. He'd known Charlie since the boy was in diapers, had taught him to hold a hammer properly just last summer. "Boys shouldn't be dragged into adult troubles," Dutch muttered, but he held out his hand. Charlie passed him the documents, the papers crackling in the forge light. Dutch moved closer to the fire, squinting at the faded ink and official stamps. His calloused fingers traced the signature lines with surprising delicacy. "These dates," he said after a long moment. "April 71 for the loan, but the signature line shows March 70. "That's what I noticed," Wade said carefully. "Territorial law says that's grounds for fraud investigation." Dutch's fingers stopped on one particular signature. His face went very still, the firelight casting deep shadows across his scarred features. "I've seen this handwriting before," he said quietly. Wade's pulse quickened. "Where?" "During the war, winter of '64, outside Vicksburg." Dutch's voice carried a strange note, something between recognition and old pain. "We captured a Confederate supply wagon. Driver had forged documents, passes, requisitions, even currency plates." "Currency plates?" "Counterfeiting operation. Confederates were flooding Union territory with fake bills, trying to destabilize our economy." Dutch held the mortgage paper closer to the fire. "This signature style, the way the W loops back on itself, it's the same hand that forged those Confederate 20s. The forge fire popped and hissed, sending fresh sparks up the chimney. Wade could smell the coal smoke, the metallic tang of heated iron, and something else, the sharp scent of burning secrets. "You're saying Whitmore was a Confederate forger?" "I'm saying someone who learned from Confederate forgers signed these papers." Dutch folded the documents carefully. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Charlie looked between them, hope dawning in his young face. "Does this mean we can save Ma's farm?" Dutch's eyes met Wade's across the forge fire. For the first time in 3 years, Wade saw something other than cold distance there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. "Problem is," Dutch said slowly, "who's going to believe a crippled blacksmith and a sheriff facing his own foreclosure?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Wade felt the weight of their shared history, the unspoken apology that had festered between them like an infected wound. "Maybe we don't need them to believe us," Wade said. "Maybe we just need to prove it." Dutch limped back to his anvil, picked up his hammer. But this time, when he looked at Wade, there was something different in his eyes, something that might have been the ghost of their old partnership. "These signatures," Dutch said quietly. "I've got some ideas about how to prove their forgeries, but it'll take time." "How much time?" Dutch glanced at Charlie, then back at the documents. "More than 3 days, that's certain." The hammer rang against iron once more, but the sound was different now. Less like a funeral bell, more like a battle cry. The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as Mayor Collins called the emergency session to order. Word had spread quickly about Wade's investigation into the bank's practices, and Whitmore had demanded this public hearing to address the sheriff's reckless accusations. The smell of wet wool and lamp oil hung heavy in the air, mixed with the sharp scent of fear that seemed to seep from the packed benches. Whitmore stood at the front of the room, his black suit immaculate as always, but Wade caught something different in his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. The banker's hands, usually steady as stone, trembled slightly as he arranged his papers. "Citizens of Millfield," Whitmore began, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "I stand before you tonight to address serious allegations made against First National Bank by Sheriff Garrett." Wade remained standing at the back of the room, his badge catching the lamplight. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the expectation and doubt warring in the faces around him. "These accusations," Whitmore continued, "stem from Sheriff Garrett's personal financial difficulties. A man facing foreclosure himself, desperate to find someone else to blame for his troubles." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson from the general store shook her head sadly. Tom Morrison, no relation to the cattleman who'd lost his ranch, looked away when Wade's eyes met his. "Furthermore," Whitmore's voice grew stronger, more confident, "I have reason to believe Sheriff Garrett has accepted bribes in exchange for his cooperation in this matter." The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Wade felt his stomach drop, the metallic taste flooding his mouth again. "That's a lie," Wade called out, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. "Is it?" Whitmore produced a leather envelope from his coat. "I have here a written statement from a concerned citizen attesting to seeing Sheriff Garrett accept payment from parties seeking to avoid their legitimate debts." Mayor Collins stood, his face grave. "Wade, these are serious charges. Do you have any evidence to support your claims against the bank?" Wade's throat felt tight. He thought of Dutch's expertise, the Confederate connection they'd discovered, but it all seemed so fragile against Whitmore's prepared assault. "I'm still gathering evidence." "How convenient," Whitmore interrupted. "Time to manufacture whatever proof might serve his purposes." The room erupted in angry voices. Wade caught fragments. "Always seemed honest before. Money changes a man. Can't trust anyone anymore." Mayor Collins banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order!" When the noise died down, Collins's voice carried the weight of inevitable judgment. "Wade, I'm afraid I have no choice. Given these allegations and your personal involvement with the bank, I'm suspending you from your duties, pending a full investigation." The words echoed in the sudden silence. Wade felt his world tilting, everything solid becoming uncertain. The smell of lamp oil seemed to thicken, choking him. "Your badge and gun, Sheriff," Collins said quietly. Wade's hands moved automatically, unpinning the star from his chest. The metal felt cold and foreign in his palm as he handed it over, along with his Colt. The crowd watched in absolute silence, the only sound the wind rattling the windows and the soft hiss of the oil lamps. "Furthermore," Whitmore added, his voice oily with false sympathy, "given Sheriff Garrett's compromised position, I'm requesting federal assistance to ensure order during this difficult time. U.S. Marshals will arrive within the week to oversee the remaining foreclosure proceedings." Wade walked toward the door, feeling stripped naked without his badge. The crowd parted before him like he carried plague, faces that had once shown respect now reflecting suspicion and disappointment. At the door he turned back. Martha Crenshaw sat in the front row, her face pale but determined. She met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture of faith that cut through the shame like sunlight through storm clouds. But it wasn't enough to stop the taste of copper pennies from flooding his mouth. The archive room beneath the courthouse smelled of mildew and forgotten secrets. Dutch moved carefully between the filing cabinets, his limp more pronounced in the cramped space. Wade held the lamp while Charlie kept watch at the door, the boy's breathing visible in the cold air. "Territorial records from the war years," Dutch muttered, pulling down a dust-covered box. If Whitmore learned his trade from Confederate forgers, there might be documentation. Wade's hands shook as he held the lamp steady. Being stripped of his badge had left him feeling hollow, purposeless. Without the weight of authority on his chest, he was just another desperate man with accusations he couldn't prove. "Here," Dutch said, opening a folder marked Captured Enemy Documents, 1864. Papers spilled across the small table. Confederate passes, requisitions, and currency plates. The lamplight revealed intricate forgeries, each bearing the distinctive handwriting style they'd identified. Dutch held up a $20 Confederate note, the ink faded but still legible. "Look at this signature, S. Whitworth. Same hand that signed Martha's mortgage papers." Wade leaned closer, comparing the documents. The similarity was unmistakable. The looping W, the distinctive flourish on the final letter, but something else caught his attention. "Whitworth," he said slowly. "Not Whitmore." "Common enough for men to change their names after the war," Dutch replied, "especially if they had reasons to hide their past." Charlie's whisper cut through their excitement. "Someone's coming." They heard footsteps on the courthouse stairs, deliberate and heavy. Dutch quickly gathered the documents while Wade extinguished the lamp. In the sudden darkness, they could hear voices, Whitmore's smooth tones and another man's gravelly response. Evidence secured in the archive room, Whitmore was saying. Need to ensure certain documents don't surface during the federal investigation. The second voice was unfamiliar, with a slight accent Wade couldn't place. How much does the sheriff know? Enough to be dangerous, but without his badge, he's just another debtor with wild theories. Their footsteps moved closer to the archive door. Wade felt Dutch's hand on his arm, guiding him toward the back exit. They moved in absolute silence, Charlie following like a shadow. The archive keeper mentioned someone examining war records, the stranger continued. Pettigrew's been asking questions about Confederate currency operations. Wade's blood ran cold. If Whitmore suspected their investigation, they slipped out the back door into the alley, cold air hitting them like a slap. The taste of danger was sharper than winter wind, metallic and urgent. Problem is, Dutch whispered as they hurried away from the courthouse, who's going to believe a crippled blacksmith and a crooked sheriff? The words carried a bitter irony now. Wade no longer had even the pretense of authority. He was just a man with suspicions and a friend whose loyalty he'd never deserved. Behind them, lamplight flickered in the archive room windows. Who's going to believe a crippled blacksmith and a crooked sheriff? Martha Crenshaw's farmhouse sat in the gray dawn light like a ship taking on water. Wade helped carry her meager possessions to the wagon Dutch had borrowed, a few quilts, some cooking pots, her husband's Bible, and a wooden chest that had belonged to her mother. The smell of wood smoke from the dying fire mixed with the sharp scent of coming snow. Charlie and Sarah moved like sleepwalkers, their young face hollow with the kind of exhaustion that came from crying until there were no tears left. Wade loaded Sarah's corn-husk dolls carefully into the wagon bed, treating them with the same respect he'd once shown evidence in criminal cases. "Don't have to do this," Martha said quietly, folding her wedding dress into a carpet bag. "You lost your badge on account of helping us." "Badge don't make the man," Wade replied, though the words felt hollow. He'd worn that star for 8 years, and without it, he felt unmoored, like a boat cut loose from its anchor. Mrs. Henderson from the general store approached across the frozen yard, her breath visible in small puffs. She carried a basket covered with checkered cloth, and Wade caught the scent of fresh bread and preserved peaches. "For the road," she said simply, pressing the basket into Martha's hands. "And this." She pulled a small leather pouch from her coat, collected it from the other women in town. "Ain't much, but it'll help you get settled somewhere." Martha's voice broke as she accepted the gift. "Thank you, Iris. I won't forget this kindness." Other neighbors began to appear, Henrik Jensen with a sack of winter apples, Tom Morrison carrying a lap robe for the wagon, even young Dr. Matthews with a bottle of tonic for the children. None of them spoke directly to Wade, but their presence felt like a quiet rebuke to the proceedings. Wade finished loading the last of the furniture, his hands aching from the cold and the weight of failure. The farmhouse looked naked, without Martha's belongings, just bare walls and empty rooms that echoed with the ghosts of better times. As they prepared to leave, Martha pressed something into Wade's palm, a small object that felt warm despite the winter air. He looked down to see a military medal, tarnished with age but still bearing the eagle and ribbon of the Army of the Republic. "My father's," she said quietly, "from Gettysburg. He always said it reminded him that some fights are worth the cost, even when you lose." Wade's throat tightened as he closed his fingers around the medal. The bronze felt solid and real, more substantial than the badge that had been stripped from his chest. "Martha, I can't—" "You can, and you will." Her voice carried the steel that had kept her family together through drought and death and now foreclosure. "Some fights are worth the cost, Wade Garrett. Don't you forget that." Charlie climbed onto the wagon seat, his young face set in lines too hard for his age. Sarah clutched her remaining doll, staring back at the only home she'd ever known. Wade helped Martha up beside her children, the wagon springs creaking under the weight of their few possessions. The metallic taste in his mouth had faded, replaced by something else, a warmth that spread from the metal in his palm through his entire chest. "Where will you go?" he asked. "My sister in El Paso. She's got room for us, at least until spring." The wagon rolled away across the frozen ground, wheels crunching on frost-brittled grass. Wade stood watching until it disappeared over the rise, the metal heavy in his hand. Some fights are worth the cost. Dutch's forge blazed against the winter evening, sparks rising like angry stars into the darkening sky. Wade found him hunched over his anvil, but instead of horseshoes or plowshares, Dutch was working with something else. Papers spread across a makeshift table, magnifying glass in hand. "Been thinking about what you said," Dutch said without looking up. "About proving those signatures are forgeries." Wade moved closer, catching the scent of hot metal and coal smoke mixed with the sharper smell of ink and parchment. Dutch had arranged several documents side by side: Martha's mortgage papers, the Confederate currency samples, and something new. "What's all this?" "If we're going to fight forgery with evidence, we need to understand how it's done." Dutch's scarred hands moved with surprising delicacy as he adjusted the magnifying glass. "Thing about forged documents, they always leave traces. Ink that doesn't match, pressure differences in the pen strokes, chemical signatures that don't belong." Wade pulled up a stool, the metal still warm in his pocket. "And you know about this how?" "Same way I know about horseshoes and barrel hoops. Man learns what he needs to survive." Dutch's voice carried old pain, memories of choices made in desperate times. "During the war, sometimes we had to adapt official documents, keep our boys fed and supplied when the bureaucrats failed them." "You forged army documents?" "I survived. We all did what we had to." Dutch finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the forge fire. "Point is, I learned to spot the signs, and Whitmore's work has signs all over it." Dutch pointed to Martha's mortgage papers with the tip of his knife. "See how the date ink bleeds different than the signature ink? That's because they were written at different times, probably with different pens." Wade leaned closer, squinting at the barely visible differences. "Would that hold up in court?" "Not by itself, but there's more." Dutch pulled out a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. "Chemical analysis. Ink from different periods has different compositions. This stuff can prove when something was written, give or take a few months." "Where did you get that?" "Doc Matthews. Turns out he's got a bit of chemistry knowledge from his medical training." Dutch's scarred face showed the ghost of a smile. "Seems the good doctor has his own questions about Whitmore's business practices." Wade felt something stirring in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. The warmth from Martha's metal seemed to spread, touching this moment with possibility. "If we're wrong about this, we'll both hang for forgery," Wade said. Dutch's hammer rang against the anvil once, sharp and clear as a bell. "Then we better not be wrong. If we're wrong about this, we'll both hang for forgery." The Cattleman's Rest saloon smelled of stale beer and unwashed bodies, with an undercurrent of desperation that seemed to seep from the very walls. Wade pushed through the batwing doors, no longer wearing his badge but still carrying himself like a lawman. The conversations died as he entered, replaced by hostile stares and whispered accusations. "Well, well," called out Jim Bradley from his corner table. "If it ain't our crooked ex-sheriff." Wade ignored the jibe and made his way to the bar, where Moses the bartender polished glasses with studied indifference. The clink of glass and the scrape of chairs filled the uncomfortable silence. "Heard you've been taking bribes, Garrett," Bradley continued, his voice loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Heard you sold out honest folks to line your own pockets." Wade's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "You hear a lot of things, Bradley. Most of them wrong." "Yeah? Well, I heard Whitmore's bringing in federal marshals to clean up your mess. About time someone with real authority took charge." The words stung because they carried truth. Wade could feel the weight of community judgment pressing down on him like a physical thing. These were men he'd served with honor for 8 years. Now looking at him like he was something dirty, they'd scraped off their boots. Henrik Jensen spoke up from near the back. "My family's next on Whitmore's list. Lost my winter wheat to early frost, can't make the payment." His weathered face showed the strain of sleepless nights. "But I reckon that don't matter to a bought sheriff." "Henrik, you know me better than that." "Thought I did." Jensen turned away, the dismissal cutting deeper than any accusation. Wade ordered whiskey he couldn't afford and tried to ignore the poisonous atmosphere. 3 more families had received foreclosure notices since Martha's eviction. 3 more families looking at him with eyes full of betrayal and lost hope. "Moses," Wade said quietly to the bartender, "you hear anything else about who might be backing Whitmore's operation?" Moses glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Heard tell there's money coming from back east. Big money. Folks say Whitmore's got partners in Chicago, maybe Denver." "What kind of partners?" "The kind that don't ask questions about how business gets done, long as profits come regular." Moses straightened as Bradley approached the bar. "But you didn't hear that from me." Bradley slammed his empty glass down hard enough to make other patrons look over. Problem with corruption, Garrett, is it spreads. Makes honest folks wonder who else might be on the take. Wade met his stare steadily. You got something specific to say, Bradley? I'm saying maybe it's time this town had new leadership. Someone who ain't compromised. The saloon had gone completely quiet now, every ear straining to hear the confrontation. Wade could smell the tension mixing with tobacco smoke and spilled beer, sharp and acrid in the close air. Before Wade could respond, the doors swung open with enough force to rattle the windows. Dutch McKenna limped in, his massive frame filling the doorway, forged soot still marking his leather apron. "Evening, boys," Dutch said, his voice carrying easy authority. "Heard there was some talk about corruption going on in here." Bradley's bluster faded slightly. Dutch McKenna wasn't a man many chose to cross, even with a bad leg. "Just discussing civic responsibility," Bradley said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Good to hear." Dutch moved to the bar, his limp pronounced, but his presence commanding. "Because I got some thoughts on that subject myself." The saloon held its collective breath. The back room of Chin's laundry smelled of soap and steam, with the constant sound of water boiling in massive tubs. Wade and Dutch sat across from Chen Wei, who'd immigrated from California 3 years prior and maintained a careful neutrality in town politics. His English was careful but precise, each word chosen with deliberation. "Mr. Whitmore, he bring clothes here twice each week," Chen said, sorting through a basket of shirts and collars. "Always very particular about timing, always Wednesday and Saturday, exactly 3 o'clock. Wade leaned forward. "You notice anything unusual about him lately? Changes in behavior?" Chen's weathered hands paused in their sorting. "Last month, he started bringing different clothes. Expensive fabric, but nervous sweat stains. And papers in pockets. Always check papers before washing." Dutch and Wade exchanged glances. "What kind of papers?" "Letters, mostly, but one time, telegram from Denver, fell out when I empty pockets." Chen's voice dropped lower. "Said something about collection deadline and Chicago interest growing impatient." Wade felt his pulse quicken. "You remember anything else from that telegram?" "Date. February 15th, something about liquidation targets and accelerated timeline." Chen resumed his sorting, but his movements were quick, nervous. "Mr. Whitmore, he very angry when he realized telegram missing, accused me of stealing, threatened to have me arrested." "But you kept it," Dutch said. It wasn't a question. Chen reached into his apron and produced a crumpled yellow paper. "Insurance. In my country, we learn to protect ourselves from powerful men who make threats." Wade's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the telegram. The message was brief but damning. "Chicago principals demand accelerated liquidation stop. February deadline. Absolute stop failure means personal consequences stop." "Personal consequences," Dutch muttered. "Sounds like Whitmore's in debt to some dangerous people." Wade studied the telegram header. "Sent from Denver, but originated in Chicago. And look at this. Addressed to S. Whitworth, not Whitmore." "So he's still using his real name for business," Dutch observed. "Sloppy." Chen cleared his throat. "There is more. Today, I see Mr. Whitmore with strange man, not from town. Expensive clothes, but hard eyes. They talk in alley behind bank. Very quiet, very serious." What did this stranger look like? Tall, thin, scar on left cheek, walk like soldier but dress like banker. Chen's voice grew more worried. When they finished talking, Mr. Whitmore looked very frightened. Hands shake when he lighted his cigar. Wade folded the telegram carefully, his mind racing. Whitmore wasn't just a local schemer. He was part of something bigger, more dangerous. And if he was under pressure from Chicago financiers with February deadlines, bank examiners coming next week, Wade said suddenly, the pieces clicking together. That's why he's rushing the foreclosures. He needs to show profits before the federal audit. Dutch nodded grimly. Desperate men make desperate choices. Question is, how desperate is Whitmore willing to get? Outside, the winter wind picked up, rattling the laundry's windows like skeleton fingers. Wade pocketed the telegram, feeling the weight of evidence that might finally turn the tide, but also feeling the growing certainty that Whitmore's desperation was about to make him more dangerous than ever. How desperate is Whitmore willing to get? Wade sat alone in his cold cabin, Martha's father's metal turning slowly in his calloused hands. The bronze caught the lamplight, its eagle wings seeming to flutter in the dancing shadows. Outside, February wind howled through the gaps in his walls, carrying the scent of snow and the distant sound of Dutch's hammer ringing against iron. The telegram from Chicago lay spread on his table beside Dutch's chemical analysis of the mortgage papers. Evidence enough to expose Whitmore's operation, but at what cost? Wade had spent the last hour staring at Dutch's proposal, forged duplicate documents that would prove Whitmore's guilt by demonstrating the same techniques. Fight forgery with forgery. The metal grew warm in his palm as he remembered Martha's words. Some fights are worth the cost, even when you lose. But what kind of man would he be after this? What kind of justice could be built on lies, even lies told to expose greater lies? A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Martha Crenshaw stepped inside, her traveling clothes still damp with snow, Charlie and Sarah behind her looking exhausted from the journey. "Martha?" Wade stood quickly, surprised. "What are you doing here? Thought you were heading to El Paso." "Got as far as the county line before I realized I was running for my own fight." Martha pulled off her worn gloves, revealing hands chapped raw from cold and work. "This ain't just about my farm anymore, is it?" Wade gestured to the papers on his table. "Whitmore's got pressure from Chicago financiers. He's targeting families across 3 counties, not just Millfield. Dozens of farms, maybe hundreds." Charlie moved to the fireplace, poking at the dying embers with a stick. "Ma says we can't let him steal everyone's homes just because he stole ours." "It's not that simple, son. What Dutch and I are planning." Wade's voice trailed off as he looked at the innocent faces of Martha's children. "It could land us both in prison." Martha studied the evidence scattered across his table, her educated mind quickly grasping the implications. "You're going to forge documents to prove he forged documents. The irony ain't lost on me. And if you're caught?" Wade picked up the metal again, feeling its weight. "Federal crime. Minimum 10 years in Yuma Territorial Prison, assuming they don't hang us for treason." Sarah tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, what's treason?" Martha knelt beside her daughter, smoothing the child's hair with gentle fingers. "It's when someone betrays the trust people place in them, sweetheart." The words hit Wade like a physical blow. He looked at the metal in his hand, thinking of Martha's father dying at Gettysburg for principles he believed worth defending. Then he looked at the forged documents Dutch wanted to create, lies that would serve justice but destroy integrity. "Martha, I've been thinking about this all wrong." Wade set the metal carefully on the table. "Your father earned this medal fighting for truth, not clever lies. If I forge evidence to catch Whitmore, I become everything I've spent 8 years fighting against." Martha's eyes searched his face. "So what's the alternative? Let him destroy every family in 3 counties? There has to be another way. Something that doesn't require me to become the very thing I'm trying to stop." Charlie looked up from the fireplace, his young voice cutting through the adult tension. "What about a trap, like when we catch rabbits for dinner?" Wade and Martha turned to him, puzzled. "You don't become a rabbit to catch a rabbit," Charlie continued with the straightforward logic of youth. "You just give him what he wants and wait for him to come get it." The simplicity of it struck Wade like lightning. He grabbed the Chicago telegram, reading it again with fresh eyes. "Accelerated liquidation, February deadline." "What is it?" Martha asked. "Whitmore's under pressure to show profits by the bank examination. What if we gave him a target too tempting to resist, something that would force him to make his forgeries in public where witnesses could see?" Martha began to understand. "You mean bait him into exposing himself?" "Exactly. No forged evidence, no lies. Just give him enough rope to hang himself with his own greed." A slow smile spread across Martha's weathered face. "What kind of bait did you have in mind?" Dutch's forge roared like a captive dragon, sparks dancing upward into the frigid night air. The blacksmith stood at his anvil, but instead of iron, he was working with brass and wood, constructing something that looked like a cross between a lectern and an altar. "Public demonstration," Dutch explained as Wade approached, Charlie trailing behind with wide eyes. "Spring festival's in 2 weeks. Perfect time to show the community some traditional metalworking techniques." Wade examined the construction, breathing in the familiar sense of hot metal and coal smoke. "And Whitmore will be there?" "Town council requires all business owners to participate. Bank's been a sponsor for 3 years running." Dutch's hammer rang against a brass fitting, securing it to the wooden frame. "Question is, will our demonstration be educational enough to draw his attention?" Wade pulled the Chicago telegram from his pocket. "What if we announced a special examination of historical documents? Educational display about frontier banking practices. You mean display the evidence publicly? I mean display obvious bait. Let Whitmore think we're about to expose him. Force him to act desperately. Wade's voice grew more confident as the plan took shape. Desperate men make mistakes. Public mistakes. Charlie tugged at Wade's sleeve. Will this hurt Mr. Whitmore? Wade knelt to the boy's level, meeting his eyes honestly. Son, sometimes the only way to stop someone from hurting others is to let them hurt themselves with their own bad choices. Dutch tested the stability of his construction, the wooden platform solid under pressure. We'll need witnesses, lots of them, and someone with authority to make arrests when Whitmore tries to destroy evidence or forge new documents. Federal marshals due next week for the bank examination, Wade said. If we time this right, big if, Dutch warned, we get one chance at this. If Whitmore smells the trap, he'll disappear with whatever money he's already stolen, and those Chicago financiers will send someone worse to finish the job. Wade stood, Martha's medal heavy in his pocket. But if we do nothing, he destroys dozens of families and moves on to the next territory. The forge fire popped and hissed, sending fresh sparks spiraling into the darkness. Dutch's scarred face showed determination mixed with old fear. We'll let the fire reveal the truth, Dutch said finally. About documents and men both. Charlie looked between the two adults, understanding more than his years should allow. When do we set the trap? Wade and Dutch exchanged glances across the glowing forge. 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to gather witnesses, 2 weeks to either restore justice to Millfield or destroy themselves trying. Spring Festival, Wade said. We'll let the fire reveal the truth about documents and men. Spring Festival. Morning arrived with the sound of hammers and the scent of fresh sawdust mixing with the lingering bite of winter air. Dutch's demonstration platform stood at the center of Millfield's main square, brass fittings gleaming in the pale sunlight. Townspeople gathered in curious clusters, their breath still visible in the cool air as vendors set up booths selling early spring vegetables and preserved goods. Wade positioned himself near the general store, no badge on his chest, but Martha's father's medal heavy in his pocket. The metallic taste had returned to his mouth. Not fear this time, but anticipation sharp as forge-heated iron. Dutch worked at his portable forge, the familiar ring of hammer on anvil drawing an appreciative crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Dutch called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. Today we'll demonstrate the ancient art of document preservation, how heat reveals truth that the naked eye cannot see. Wade caught sight of Whitmore near the bank entrance, the man's usual composure cracked like ice under spring sun. Sweat beaded on the banker's forehead despite the cool air, and his hands trembled as he adjusted his gold watch chain. Federal Marshal Davies stood with Mayor Collins near the platform, his presence lending official weight to the proceedings. Davies was a lean man with sharp eyes who'd arrived 2 days early for the bank examination, claiming routine schedule changes. Wade had spent an hour yesterday briefing him on their suspicions. The process is quite simple, Dutch continued, holding up a sample document. Genuine ink responds to controlled heat differently than forgeries. Watch carefully. He placed the paper near the forge flames, not close enough to burn, but sufficient to warm the parchment. The crowd pressed closer, Charlie and Sarah among them, with Martha holding their hands protectively. You see how the genuine signatures remain stable, while altered portions begin to show stress? Dutch's scarred hands moved with practiced precision. Now, if someone were to bring documents they suspected of forgery, Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his voice sharp with forced authority. This is highly irregular. Official documents shouldn't be subjected to such amateur analysis. Nothing amateur about it, Dutch replied calmly. This technique's been used by Army quartermasters and territorial courts for years. Very reliable for detecting document tampering. Wade watched Whitmore's face cycle through emotions. Calculation, fear, and finally desperate resolve. The banker's hand moved inside his coat, withdrawing a leather portfolio thick with papers. If we're conducting public examinations, Whitmore announced, his voice growing stronger, then let's examine all suspicious documents. I have here evidence of Sheriff Garrett's corrupt practices, forged statements, false testimony. The crowd murmured with renewed interest. Whitmore moved toward the platform, his step gaining confidence as he sensed an opportunity to discredit Wade permanently. Mr. Whitmore, Marshal Davies stepped forward, his voice carrying federal authority. Those are some serious allegations. Perhaps we should examine your evidence first. Whitmore hesitated, caught between retreat and advance. These documents prove Garrett's been taking bribes, falsifying reports. Then let's see what the fire reveals, Dutch said mildly, gesturing toward his forge. The trap was sprung. Whitmore couldn't back down without appearing guilty, but submitting his forged evidence to heat analysis would expose him. Wade held his breath, tasting copper and smoke in the sharp edge of justice finally within reach. Of course, Whitmore said, his voice steady despite the sweat now running freely down his face. I have nothing to hide. He handed the first document to Dutch, who examined it briefly before holding it near the forge heat. Within moments, portions of the text began to shimmer and fade, clear evidence of document alteration. The crowd gasped. Marshal Davies stepped closer, his hand moving casually toward his sidearm. Interesting, Dutch observed. This signature appears to have been added months after the original document was written. See how the ink composition differs? Whitmore's face went pale as fresh snow. There must be some mistake. Let's try another, Dutch suggested, reaching for the next paper in Whitmore's portfolio. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Whitmore, realizing his forged evidence was betraying him, lunged toward the forge with desperate strength. His intent was clear: destroy the documents before they could damn him further. But Dutch was ready. The blacksmith's massive hand caught Whitmore's wrist, stopping him inches from the flames. Papers scattered across the platform as they struggled, the crowd backing away in alarm. "Marshal!" Dutch called out, maintaining his grip despite Whitmore's frantic efforts to escape. Davies moved with practiced efficiency, producing iron shackles from his coat. But before he could apply them, Whitmore broke free and stumbled backward, his hand fumbling inside his jacket. "You don't understand," Whitmore gasped, his composure completely shattered. "Chicago. They'll kill me if I don't deliver the money. I had no choice." The admission rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Wade stepped forward, Martha's metal solid and warm against his palm. "There's always a choice, Whitmore. You chose greed over honor." Easy words from a man who's never owed money to killers. Well, Whitmore's hand emerged from his jacket, clutching a small derringer. "Stand back, all of you!" The crowd scattered, mothers pulling children to safety behind vendor stalls. Wade found himself between Whitmore's gun and Charlie, who'd been too slow to retreat with the others. "Put it down," Marshal Davies ordered, his own weapon drawn. "You're only making this worse." "Worse?" Whitmore laughed, the sound cracked and desperate. "You think territorial prison is worse than what Chicago will do to me? At least in Yuma, I'll live long enough to regret my choices." The derringer wavered between Wade and the marshal, Whitmore's hand shaking with exhaustion and terror. Behind him, papers continued to smolder near the forge, evidence of his crimes literally going up in smoke. Wade caught Dutch's eye and saw understanding pass between them. While Whitmore focused on the marshal, Dutch casually reached for his hammer. "Mr. Whitmore," came a new voice from the crowd's edge. A thin man in an expensive suit stepped forward, the scar on his left cheek visible even from a distance. "Chicago sent me to check on your progress." Whitmore's face went white as bone. The derringer in his hand began to shake violently. "Looks like your progress has been disappointing," the stranger continued, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man accustomed to violence. That's when Dutch's hammer flew through the air, striking Whitmore's gun hand with surgical precision. The derringer spun away harmlessly as the banker collapsed, clutching his broken wrist and sobbing. Marshal Davies had the stranger in custody before he could react, while Wade retrieved the scattered documents from around the forge. The papers that hadn't burned told the complete story: forged mortgages, altered dates, and correspondence with Chicago financiers detailing a land fraud scheme spanning 3 territories. The taste of copper pennies finally faded from Wade's mouth, replaced by something cleaner, something that might have been justice. But it was the early bank examiner, arriving 2 days ahead of schedule, that sealed Whitmore's fate. The Millfield courthouse steps buzzed with quiet satisfaction as Federal Marshal Davies emerged with his prisoners in chains. Whitmore stumbled between 2 deputies, his broken wrist splinted and his face hollow with the knowledge of what awaited him in federal prison. The Chicago enforcer walked with resigned dignity, understanding that his own organization would likely abandon him now that their operation was exposed. Wade stood beside Dutch at the edge of the crowd, watching justice finally take its course. The spring sun felt warm on his shoulders, carrying the scent of new grass and apple blossoms from the trees lining Main Street. The metallic taste that had plagued him all winter was gone, replaced by the clean sweetness of fresh air and honest work. Territorial court will sort out the land titles, Marshal Davies announced to the gathered townspeople. All fraudulent foreclosures are hereby voided pending federal investigation. Families who lost their property will be fully restored. A cheer went up from the crowd. Henrik Jensen wept openly, his weathered hands shaking as neighbors clapped his shoulders in congratulation. Tom Morrison lifted his hat and called out thanks to Dutch, whose hammer had ended the banker's reign of terror with surgical precision. Mayor Collins approached Wade, his face bearing the weight of apology and shame. "Wade, about your badge." I spoke hastily, without proper investigation. Town council voted unanimously this morning. We'd be honored to have you back as sheriff. Wade accepted the star Collins offered, its familiar weight settling against his chest like an old friend returning home. But it felt different now, heavier with earned wisdom, polished by the fire of genuine testing. "Obliged, Mayor, but things will be different from now on. No more taking a banker's word over a citizen's oath." "Understood completely," Collins nodded gravely. "Trust but verify, as they say." Dutch limped over, his massive frame casting a welcome shadow. "So what's first, Sheriff Garrett?" Wade looked across the square to where Martha Crenshaw stood with her children, their faces bright with the possibility of going home. Charlie was carving a piece of wood with steady, patient strokes, a skill Dutch had taught him during their long winter of planning. "First thing, help folks get back to their proper homes." Wade's hand moved to his pocket, feeling the warm bronze of Martha's father's metal. Some debts need paying. Martha's farmhouse looked different in the spring light, as if the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath all winter. The front porch that had sagged under the weight of foreclosure notices now stood straight and proud, freshly painted by neighbors who'd arrived at dawn with hammers and lumber. Wade helped carry Martha's belongings back from the wagon, the same quilts and cooking pots, her husband's Bible, and the wooden chest that had traveled to El Paso and back. But there were new additions, too, gifts from townspeople who'd felt helpless during the winter and now wanted to make amends. "Feels strange," Martha said, setting her mother's china carefully on the kitchen shelf. "Like coming back from the dead." "Feel familiar soon enough?" Wade replied, testing the sturdiness of a repaired table leg. "Land has a way of welcoming folks home." Charlie burst through the door, his arms full of fresh-cut pine boughs. "Ma, Dutch says we can build a proper workshop behind the barn. Teach me blacksmithing proper-like." Sarah followed with a bouquet of early wildflowers, her corn-husk doll tucked securely under one arm. "Sheriff Garrett, will you stay for supper? Ma's making cornbread." The invitation carried weight beyond mere hospitality. Wade had spent too many evenings alone, in his cold cabin, tasting copper pennies and wondering if justice was just a word folks used to make themselves feel better about an unfair world. "I'd be honored, Miss Sarah." As evening settled over the restored farmhouse, Wade found himself on the front porch with Dutch and Martha, watching the children chase fireflies in the growing dusk. The air smelled of cornbread and coffee, wood smoke, and the rich earth of freshly planted gardens. "You ever wonder how different things might have been?" Martha asked, her voice thoughtful in the gathering darkness. "If Whitmore had never come to town, or if that first family had fought back harder." Wade fingered the metal in his pocket, thinking of Martha's father dying at Gettysburg for principles that seemed as distant as stars. "Reckon we don't get to choose our battles, just how we fight them." Dutch's coffee cup clinked against the porch railing as he set it down. "Some fights are worth the cost, even when you lose, but this time, we didn't lose." "This time," Martha agreed, watching Charlie demonstrate his carving technique to Sarah. "Think Whitmore learned that lesson?" "Whitmore learned the price of choosing greed over conscience," Wade said. "Whether that counts as learning, well, that's between him and whatever's left of his soul." A comfortable silence settled over them, broken only by the children's laughter and the distant sound of Dutch's hammer as night shift cowboys worked late at neighboring ranches. The metallic ring no longer sounded like a funeral bell, but like honest work building something worth keeping. Wade thought about the letter he'd received that morning, official notification that the federal investigation had uncovered similar land fraud operations in Colorado and New Mexico territories. Other sheriffs, other communities would need help cleaning up the mess left by Chicago financiers and their local collaborators. But that was tomorrow's fight. Tonight, there was cornbread cooling on Martha's windowsill, children safe in their proper home, and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, truth burned brighter than the lies that tried to smother it. Some fights are worth the cost, Wade thought, listening to the honest sounds of home restored. Even when you lose, the fighting matters. But this time, they hadn't lost it all. Spring came early to Millfield that year, as if the land itself celebrated justice restored. Wade stood on Martha's porch 3 months later, watching her children chase butterflies through the wildflowers that had sprouted where foreclosure notices once lay scattered like fallen leaves. Dutch's forge still rang with honest work, but the sound carried different meanings now, healing rather than hiding, building rather than breaking. The metallic taste of fear had given way to the sweet scent of apple blossoms and fresh-turned earth, rich with the promise of good harvest. "You reckon it was worth it?" Dutch asked, settling beside Wade with 2 cups of coffee, his limp barely noticeable in the warm weather. Wade fingered Martha's father's medal in his pocket, thinking of all the papers that had burned in the forge fire, all the lies that had crumbled under the heat of simple truth. "A man's word ought to mean something," he said finally. "Document or no document, forge or no forge, truth has a way of rising to the surface like cream in fresh milk." Martha appeared in the doorway, her face no longer gaunt with worry but full with the contentment of coming harvest. "Sheriff Garrett, Dutch, dinner's ready. Charlie caught 3 fine trout from the creek this morning." As they walked inside together, Wade heard the sound that had started it all, paper rustling in the wind. But now it was just Martha's laundry drying on the line, white sheets dancing like surrender flags turned to victory banners. Some battles are fought with guns, others with laws and clever schemes, but the ones that matter most are fought with conscience, one decent choice at a time. That's what Wade learned that winter, and what he'd remember long after the last snow melted and the first wheat grew tall in Martha Crenshaw's restored fields. Truth, he'd discovered, was like good iron. It only got stronger when tested by fire.